Good evening, good evening, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Erudition Network. I am your host for today's Black Interactive program, Eddie Phillips. Today is December the 8th. We are getting closer and closer to Christmas. If you are watching the program for the first time, I'm going to welcome you to this interactive episode. We do these episodes on Thursday nights, and we open up the ability for you to come on and ask questions and provide your own thoughts onto our discussion. Erudition Network is a network that is dedicated to sharing knowledge and information on Black history. And so it's a labor of love. We get on here every Thursday and we talk about our history or Black history, cultural history, which in my terms, I see it as American history. And so it is something that I think that we need to spend time with and something that we need to invest our time in learning with our young people. So I get on here every Thursday and give about an hour of the day on Thursdays for us to sit here and discuss Black history. I am not typically when I get ready to do this show on Thursdays, I take the time to wait for people to get on and engage with the program. Tonight, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go directly into this lesson and I'm going to get at it because here's the thing. I've been doing this for quite some time now. And if you watch our advertisements, which I try to send out, and you know anything about me, you know that I'm dedicated for us to sit here and discuss Black history. So I'm not going to belabor it. Tonight, we're going to get it straight into it. We're 3 minutes in right now. So I ask you, if you're watching, the people that we're on right now, share it, get people, say, hey, look, the Erudition is live. They're out here trying to teach tonight. But I want to get into this. So last week, we talked about Africa. And we tried to talk about the African in history. And I started this because I wanted us to do a series where we start to talk about African culture and its evidence and how it has grown, right? And how we get to where we are. And in order to do that, you have to talk about some things that are historical, but are also scientific, that are also basically bring in a lot of knowledge to try to explain why things happened in the way that they did. And unfortunately, this week, I wasn't able to really sit down and do a lot of PowerPoint. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I may pull up some pictures as we go through this, but I really want us to have an understanding. I see some. Hey, what's up, Tony? Good to see you, man. I appreciate you. I want us to start trying to really get into this thing. Okay. Last week we had a really good discussion, and we talked about the African, and we went through a lot of things. I'm just going to recap that just a little bit. And we talked about the topography. We talked about how Africa and how it's laid out. We talked about the 3 zones. And I wanted us to understand those 3 zones because I feel that a lot of times when we talk about Africa, we act like as if this history is not so is widely known and everybody plays like they know the history. But in truth, there is a lot of confusion there. And so I'm going to run over this really quickly. When you look at Africa, you're looking at one of the largest continents in the world. It is home And science has proven that man originated in Africa. All our fossilized data, the DNA data points toward an African heredity, right? That's where we come from. But Africa is a very strange place. It has tropical rainforests. It has humid subtropical. It has savannas. It has mountains. It has deserts, highlands. It has marine areas. And because of that, it is very diversified in how life had to form there. When we looked at the northern Africa, which we see now is a desert with little rainfall and areas where, with very limited water, except as you go towards the mid, right? So we can see that there is a desert here, right? We're going to get into tonight why that is. As you go down a little bit further, you get into a zone 2 where things are more tropical. It's where the rainfall, heavier rainfall. It is where most of the tribes of the people who live there, they had abundant vegetation. They could raise animals, excuse me, grow crops. They had streams. It was a very diverse place to live where you could do a lot more things. As you go down further south, you start to see that there is still some areas that are lush, but it's still less rainfall, but there is still some vegetation. These areas 1 and 3, top and bottom, made it where a lot of the cultures that a lot of us come from, a lot of the African Americans come from, where these were hardworking people who had to learn how to work the land, had to learn specialized skills in order to survive. So when we talk about Africa in this way, we have to really, really get into that and understand that it's not just a one laid out area. When we were kids, they would tell us that, well, Africa is the land of the lions and all of the animals. Well, that's not in every part of Africa. And because it is so important to know the layout, because it's important to know the layout in order to evaluate it to the humanity that came out of it. In order to understand the skill sets and the abilities of the people who came out of there. When we talk about African cultures, a lot of times we specify only a few of them. And we don't really get into how those cultures came to be. So last week we spent that time in talking about that, and it was important. And we even went into talking a little bit more, probably more than I wanted to, about the idea of African slavery, about the idea of how, because every time you turn around, people tell you, well, Africans had slaves. And we went into that. The differences between chattel slavery, which meant that anything that came out of you, everybody, you are perpetual slavery. And the idea of pawnship or debt slavery, where you owed someone something. So you basically became a servant, not necessarily a slave, but a servant until that debt was paid off. And then we talked about military slavery, whereas one nation fought another, and now you are put into slavery. But in a lot of those cases, people were either able to buy themselves eventually out or escape. And we also talked about how slavery was not something heavily pushed in Africa in a way we think of it here in America, because the areas were very hard to live in. When you look at zone 1 and zone 3, when you look at the north and the south, it's very hard to have a slave. You can, right? When everybody has to work in order to survive. Rebellions happen and things happen. So we talked a lot about some of those things, probably not as much in detail as some would. And I'm only going to do what I can when I interact with you on the interactive. Speaking of that, let's see who's on here. Matthew, good to see you. Sean Anthony. Hey, Sean Anthony, happy that you're on here. Matthew again. And it had a lot of materials and food. Yes, it did. Matthew again. That's what they want to focus on, certain bad parts that could get you killed, okay? So here's the thing. Tonight, we're going to go a little deeper than what we did last week, because this is going to take a little while. And please feel free. I asked this last week, and I say it again. If you're watching the program and you watch the program after the fact, please do not feel you cannot leave questions, suggestions, reflections, anything in the chat. We welcome it. I promise you, we will get back with you and answer whatever questions or comments that you have, and cover whatever information that you seek, because I believe that that's important, and I don't believe in blowing people off and not answering questions. This is what this whole interactive thing is about. This is what we try to do on the interactive. You can do it either on Facebook or do it on YouTube, our YouTube station. You can do that also, and we will definitely get back with you and we will talk to you about that. All right. Tonight, because we're already 12 minutes in, I'm getting very, very, very much to the idea of time, because we're going to have a lot to talk about, and I want to make sure I give a lot of the time that I can to talk about it. When I ask you, about Africa, what cultures in Africa do you usually hear about? Give me some of the top three. Top three African cultures that immediately are discussed. I'll give you a second to type that in. Go ahead. What are the cultures in Africa that are usually discussed? Anybody? Nobody? All right. Well, look, here's the thing. I'll throw one in here before anybody types, because maybe there's a little bit of a delay. One of the major ones that is always mentioned are the Egyptians. Every time somebody talks about Africa, one of the biggest civilizations over here comes down to Egyptians. And Tony Briscoe makes a very good point here. They almost always separate Egypt from Africa. Almost always. And there's a reason for that. The Horn of Africa, the southern part, north and central areas. Yeah, a little bit. I hear that too. Mutilation. I don't know what that is, but not in much detail. I do agree, not in much detail. They don't really want you to go into much detail. Here's the thing about Africa, and I'm going to very much focus tonight, and maybe I will get further into the Ethiopian, but here's the thing that angers me historically, as far as it pertains to Africa. The original Africans or the Saharan people, they were black, and they were indigenous to Africa, and then that's who the Egyptians come from. They don't come from the Europeans. They're not populated by the folks from the Mediterranean, across the Mediterranean, the Greeks, the Turks. That's none of that. They were indigenous to Africa. It's a proven fact. And we're going to get into it hopefully a little bit before the end of the hour. But you will notice one thing about the Egyptian culture, rather you're talking, whatever kingdom that you're talking about, right? Rather it's the old, middle, or new, you will notice something about the Egyptians And I will even throw the Nubians in here too. You will notice one significant thing that those cultures focused on, even in their mythology. I'm hitting to that. Can somebody who's out here tonight tell me something that they definitely have in their culture, that we see in their hieroglyphics, that we see in their tombs? What is something that they focused on? And I'm not talking about their spirituality, because that's huge. But what is the other thing that they focused on very heavily? They do make them white-skinned. Something other than just their spirituality, because their spirituality is heavy. Africans by nature are spiritual people. But what else do they focus on? The sun, that's one. What else? All right, I'm giving y'all some time. I'm trying to make this interactive tonight. Monetary value, okay. Togetherness, what you got here, Tony? They didn't even know about the Grand Canyon and its link to Egypt, okay. I'm going to tell you, I'll give it to you, so we're not having dead air. You're absolutely right when someone said the sun. Medical advances, I saw that you put that on there, Tony. That's two. But one of the major things that they talked about, that they focused on, was the sky, the space, the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars. They spent a lot of time in their mapping of these areas. And they did this for a reason. Because here's the thing, right? It was so important to them to understand this. And tonight we're going to kind of go into why that is. Because they were very, very smart. And we have a tendency to assume because they were Neolithic or they were primitive or Stone Age, they didn't think these things. But early man did. When you look at around 8,000 BCE, right, you will find that there were Neolithic, right, Neolithic, Stone Age people, indigenous folks in Africa. Now, we know this from the Bible. If you're a biblical person, you read the Bible and they talk about this also, right? And these people lived in the Sahara because at the time, right, at that time, the Sahara was warm, humid, nice, right? It had a good, let's pull up the thing from last week. Let's show that. Let me show that. I'm going to go a couple of slides. So if we go back to this, right, and we look at the way it was warm in the Sahara at the time, right? And so because it was so warm and humid, and they could grow plants, and they could fish, and they could raise animals and a family, and everybody could eat in abundance. And it was not, even though there were animals, they were not untamable or not animals that you could not fight off, and you could prosper there. But there is a funny thing that happened. There's a funny thing that happened. So as they sat here in that area making their culture, something happened within these areas. When we look at this map here, and it says 92% of the continent of Africa experiences climatic control, shortage of water where it is needed most, and oversupply of water where it cannot be fully used. See that thing that says that right there? Right? And it also tells you over 50% of Africa has inadequate precipitation. Lastly, Africa has about 1/3 of all the arid lands in the world. Now, you may be saying to yourself, Eddie, why do we care about that? Right? That's all great. That's all fine. But what does that have to do with where we are right now? Well, I'm going to talk to you tonight about that. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into things than I usually do and show some other parts of my studies that have what that has shown me. Okay. Because I think that this is important. I'm bringing up these slides right now. I'm going to share this with you. Give me a moment, because I think we should talk about these things. All right. Let's see if this is the one I want here. There we go. All right. You see this right here? Some of y'all, if you don't, just follow me. Follow me. If you don't know anything about insulation, if you don't know about the way that the world works, the orbitology, follow me. I promise you, I'm going to walk you through this tonight, and I'm going to be very, very clear. You see, science, right, can be traced. And I know a lot of people, religious people, some of them get scared of science. But science does nothing but point, in my mind, away to God, right? When we talk about how the people in the Sahara were living with and prospering, but science shows us that there was a climatic event that happened in the Sahara, and it dried things up and made it into that desert land that we saw on the map before. And what that is called solar insolation. Solar insolation is the amount of electromagnetic energy that the Earth receives from the sun. That's what it is. And solar insolation affects things. We still have insolation here, right? So when the incoming solar energy that reaches the Earth, the atmosphere and the surface, the energy is released from the sun, and it can affect the atmosphere. Most carefully, the thermosphere. But the important thing to remember is that some of the absorbed radiation reaches the Earth's surface, right? As it diffuses, as it gets around the radiation, but it can affect the climate. This is why you have certain areas of the world has deserts. And what happened was, when this went down, insulation, right? That solar insulation, because of the way that the Earth rotates, the weeble wobble of the Earth, right? And so when you consider that was going on, what wound up happening, the energy released from the sun affected Africa, a large continent that occupies multiple hemispheres of the Earth. And because the Earth is tilted at a 23.5 degree angle relative to the sun, it started to burn and do things to that climate. Now, when this happens, as you look at the chart, at the map that I gave you here, you start to see how insulation burns, right? Because of the way that the Earth is tilted. It can affect many things on the Earth. Now, this is a lesson for some of us who may have heard about this in science and things like that, but it's not necessarily explained to us how it affected our ancestors. Okay? And because of those issues that they had, because of the change in climate, they had to move. They had to go other places because they could not stay where they could not be able to prosper anymore. It's as if you were living in a lush land and everything started to dry up. Your animals don't live, they can't eat, they can't graze. It's too hot, your family can't survive. Now, this is important as we think of this biblically too, because a lot of our ancestors who were more fair-skinned, white, they had to move too. People had to leave and had to transition to different areas of the world in order to survive. Some sailed, some went around coast, but they had to get, there's movement here because you cannot survive in the area. Now, thousands of years can pass as this effect starts to take place. We are spoiled in our thinking of time and history, because when I say 1,000 years, a lot of times, a lot of people say, well, that's a long time. It is, but let me consider something. Let me ask you to consider something. How long has the British Crown been around? How long has the Catholic Church been around? 1,000 years in the span of man's existence is not a long time. 100 years is not a long time. It's a long time to us because of how long we live. But as people transitioned out of the Sahara and they went different places, but we're going to focus our attention tonight on the Egyptians. Because every time that I hear someone tell me that the Egyptians aren't black, it burns me. Because what do you think? They're African. What do you think they came from? And we need to understand that it wasn't up until the 1970s, right? Let's be specific. January 1974, right? There was a symposium that was held in Cairo, and it was called The Peopling of Ancient Egypt. And European and Arab scholars claimed that the ancient Egyptians were Caucasian. That's 1974. And it took two African professors who stood up, Professor Diop and Professor Obinga, and said, this is a lie, this is fanatic, this is crazy. Ancient Egypt was peopled from Neolithic infancy, which is what we're talking about tonight, by blacks, by black Africans. But we take one report, we take these ideas because folks want to assign themselves to something that they think is better. And it's better for me. And what I said here, European and Arabs who wanted to align themselves to say, oh no, they're Caucasian. But the science doesn't show that. But when it was published by the United Nations, because if you don't know what UNESCO is, that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The United Nations told the world, when Tony Briscoe said earlier, right? They told the world that the Egyptians were white. So they effectively tried to separate Egypt from Africa. But don't get confused in the idea of when that happened. When I'm telling you tonight, I'm breaking it to you tonight. If you don't know, they were black. They were black. And let me tell you how science proves this. It's important that we consider that when that change of climate happened, people migrated into different places in the Nile Valley. The Bible talks to us about famines and things that were going on during the times of the Bible, and talks about how people would go to the Nile Valley, that they would go to Egypt, And that's where they will go to find their ability to eat, to grow, to live along the Nile Valley. We're going to get into this tonight because I want you to understand what that meant. I'm going to give you guys a term. Does anybody know, and you could go Google, because I'm sure it's able to Google it, what the Wadi Kubanaya is? Have you ever heard of the Wadi Kubanaya? Just give me a yes or a no in the chat real quick. Wadi Kubanaya. Have you ever heard it in your school books? Is it a general term that you understand, that you've seen? Tony said he never heard of it. Okay, he's one. Anybody else? Have you heard of the Wadi Kubanaya? Sean Anthony said no. Try to open this up here. Nope. Teddy said nope, can't even spell it. The Wadi Kubanaya is important. It's important because historically it gives us validation, right, as to what was going on in these areas, right? I like to validate my things by facts. When I do erudition, this is a shot of a wadi in Egypt. But the reason that I focus heavily on the Wadi Kubanaya, right, is because when climatic changes happen in Africa and people had to go to zone 1 and zone 3, and some went down to zone 2 where they could still live. Others didn't have the ability. It's a very large place. So what they did was they went where they could get help. The Nile Valley was one of them. The Wadi Kubanaya is a site that we know proves African, I'm going to say it again for those in the back seats, African Saharan life populated Egypt. Because the Wadi Kubanaya, right, people settled down, they grew crops in that valley, such as barley and wheat, and we can go back and they've excavated those areas and found evidence of life there. The picture you're seeing right now is called a wadi. And if you don't know what I never heard of it. A wadi is a place where when rain comes down, the valley fills with water. It forms a stream, right? And the wadis are lush and great places. People who travel, right, migrated people, they could go there and they could live and feed their animals. They can get water. It was a lush place where they were able to go in and survive. Wadis normally appear in deserts. But on the side of the Nile, there were a lot of wadis where people could establish a community and they could live there for a while and get away from the desert. So these people took really great advantage of those now fertile floodlands. And what they did was they sat there and they fed their animals. They grew their families, their culture. These were Black people. And what's funny, what stands out to me is that science knows about the wadis. They know, archaeologists know about it, even though y'all never heard of it. But in 1974, they stood up there and lied to create a division and to take away what they thought was an advanced culture that showcased European mentalities, not understanding that Africa influenced every part of the world. Life came out of Africa. When you go look up tonight, that's your homework assignment. I don't care where you go. Go look up Wadi Kubanaya. If you cannot spell it, as Teddy said, I will put it right now in the chat for you. And you all go and look that up. Study. Find the fossils and the things that they found in the Wadi Kubanaya. And understand that this shows you that there was life there. And the reason why there was life there, because of what did we say earlier? What did we call it? Insulation. The effect of the earth on Africa. Right? Cause cultures to move. When we start talking about cultural movement, then we can start talking about Egypt as a dynasty, Egypt as a place of civilization. Then we can start to understand why, right? Years later, why you had those first dynasties of Egypt, why you had these pre-diagnostic, not the pharaohs that established themselves in the cities of Memphis, right? While you understand the rise and the ascension of King Sennacherib, right? That marked the beginning of Egypt's old kingdom. Now, let's get into the other interesting part. We know that it was space, the weeble wobble of the earth, that helped to push people into different places. If you know that something happened here, did you know that the world's earliest stone circle, these stones aligned to the stars and the sun, were erected in the Nabta Playa in southern Egypt? Did you know that? And that was around 7,500 BCE. 7,500 BCE. I gave you tonight why they did that. These are not ignorant people. They marked areas and they could see the deviations. Now, these are deviations, and when something is deviating, is this affecting my life? Yes. The sun seems a little bit closer than it used to. What's going on? Curiosity. So when I asked the question earlier tonight, what do you see that the Egyptians focused on a lot? Somebody said it. The sun. For all of you all who are watching this tonight, you can understand now why people worship the way they did, why they thought the way they did. Because in their minds, they're trying to figure out, whoa, the sun is killing a lot of things here. It dictates a lot. We need to have a sun god, a sun understanding. If you go through Egyptian writing, you will see that they have something called the hymn to the sun. But this is based in what happened to Africa, not Europe. So knowing this, why would people even lie? Why would historians even lie and tell you, oh, they're Caucasian? They didn't come from. Even known historians for quite some time in the 60s and the 50s were starting to believe this lunacy. And they only really came out and validated in their minds in the 70s. When you look at African history, you will notice, right, that and we're going to get more into that next week because I'm not going to have time to do it today. But you will start to see that in Egyptian history, right, that the stone tools that were found in Nile Valley, right, they call it Fayum, right, they started to name some of the areas based on the remains they were discovering. When you go look at African or Egyptian maps, that's the reason why they wanted to go dig these areas up. How did these people survive? How did they make a kingdom in this area that in the way that they did? You know how? Because they traded with other Africans. We talked over the last few months. I've talked to you all about other cultures that occupied the space, that helped the Egyptians. They didn't do it by themselves. The Nubians, right? When you look at all of the imported gold, when you look at all the obsidian, which is the volcanic glass, that came from Nubia. The Nubians helped to build their pyramids, design their tombs. Can you grow wood in the desert? No. The cedar and the wood came from the Phoenicians. And you all heard me talk many times about the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were sailors, and they were people who traded. But when we talk about this, and we just portray Africa being a certain way, we need to understand those climates, because they play a part in how those cultures had to come together. When you look at the cultures, the Gersenian culture, right? They came around 3,500 to 3,200 BCE. And all of the pots and the things that you see, right? But we have to understand these cultures. They made up the upper Egypt. If you don't know the kingdoms and the times, and I challenge you tonight, come back next week ready to go. Go study the old, middle, and new kingdom of Egypt before you tell me that the Egyptians were white. Before you can sit here and tell me with a straight face, tell me what was going on at those times. There's a reason why they mummified the dead, right? There's a reason why they believed in the sun. These things didn't just happen in some kind of vacuum. They happened because of what people went through. And the reason why Richard Spencer told Roland Martin that, Tony, was because he was convinced, just as I'm on here tonight, talking about these things in an interactive. They have people, they get together, the alt-right people, they get together and they give each other credit for all of this. There's a reason why Hitler sent his troops to Africa. There's a reason why the Nazis wanted Africa. Africa is important to our understanding, to our way of life. I got a quote here from Chika Ante-Diop, right? He was a Senegalese historian. He passed away in 1986. And one of the things, I keep this quote as several quotes on my desktop, and it says, "The history of Black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. There's a reason why when we go further in time, the Ottomans in 1500 made a point that they wanted Egypt. There is a reason why people transitioned down to the Nubian valleys. There is also a reason why Europeans, once they got a hand on it, tried to turn the understanding away from Africa and told other folks, oh, it's the dark country. Nobody knows anything that's down there, why they were stealing wealth out of it. Why they were stealing wealth out of it. There's a reason why I'm doing this series right now. And I'm talking to you all about this as best I can without a formal, full-on, hour-long, boring history lesson. And I want your interaction. And I'm going to give you things that I think you need to go look up. We have about 15 minutes. And I open the floor to any of you all out there to ask questions about what we just talked about, to further your understanding, to know what was going on at that time. I'm here for it. I'm here for it. Because these things need to be discussed. We need to discuss these things. Because I hear so much about the Egyptians, but I don't hear enough about who they really were and what they really are. In my opinion, as I look at history, the Egyptians were just a warring version of the Phoenicians. They were a people who initially started as just a regular culture, people that wanted to trade, wanted to do things, wanted to be able to survive. But then they became warrioristic. They became imperialistic. They became people who wanted to have dynasties. When Narmer Amenes came into power, it's funny, Tony, because he was called the Endurer. That's what he was called. When he came into power as the founding head of Egypt, right? Under his control, they conquered Lower Egypt. I'm going to specify what I just said. Conquered. And they formed the first dynasty. Once we get into a conquering mentality, things change. It's no longer about the culture being free to do whatever. It's you are now under this rule. Now, it's important to understand, too, that at this time, what was also going on was that there was influence coming from other parts across the Med. European conquerors. So when we start looking at that, we understand what that is. When we look at Egypt and their idea of the divine ruler, the Pharaoh, God on earth, the influence of that, right? Even on European cultures. Now I'm no longer just a warrior. I'm now a god. We see that even with the Romans and the Greeks and how they try to raise their kingdoms and people up to god status, demigod status. They got that from looking at the Egyptians. Because how do us maintain order? People fear God. How do I maintain it? That I am God's a God or God's person here on earth. We could trace that all the way to what some things we see even here in the modern day. So I wanted us to discuss this tonight because I thought it was very important. I still think it's very important to understand the layout, the makeup. How did this come about? And I wanted to disqualify as we go into next week and we start talking about Nubia, as we start to go into the Bantu migrations. You got to slow walk this. And as we start to understand this, and I'm not going to go, because here's the thing, the reason that I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight breaking down to you every kingdom in the old, middle, and new kingdoms of Egypt is because guess what? They put that in the books. They put that in the books because they told you in 1974 that they were white. And they have been trying to perpetuate that myth for the better part of 150 years. Go out and get a couple of books, because you know I'm going to throw a couple of books at you. Right? Go out there and get Rufus Lewis Perry's book, The Cushite. Go read that book. Go out, Pastor Razor. I will always support Pastor Razor's book, Biblically Black and Blessed, and look at the migration parts. Right? Go read those books. Go out and get The Negro in Our History by Carter G. Woodson. Learning who you are is so important. It is extremely important. And the only way to do that is to go out and read. Go out and understand where you come from. As we start getting into other areas of Africa, right? When we start talking about Kumbai, or Ghana as we call it. We're going to get into all of that because I do believe we have to spend some time. We have to spend some time, as best I could do, on this interactive program. Right? I want to talk about next week, we're going to start talking about the other parts of Africa, but I wanted to kind of cover Egypt tonight and its settling and the truth of how it came to be and why. Next week, we'll start talking about Ethiopia. We'll start getting into these other smaller kingdoms. We'll start to see how they supplied the wealth that the Greeks, the Romans, right, later stole from Africa mostly through Egypt. The conflict between what was Ethiopia in their old times and Egypt, and the times in which they agreed. We'll talk about the mending, Mele. We'll talk about the Songhai Empire coming up over the couple of weeks. We really got to get into this African thing and really understand it deeply. Well, we're coming up on the last 5 minutes of the program. They true? Very true. Have you read or seen Hebrew? So I will say, yes, I have. and I did not like it. And maybe I will do a show as to why I did not like it. But I will hit you with this. I will hit you with this. One of my issues with history is that you need to cite, you need to source what you're talking about. The particular program that you're talking about angered me for one primary reason. Had nothing to do with the politics or the whatever. It claimed certain things were false. One thing that it claimed was that, and I'll give you some of it, it claimed that it made an idea that this was false, that the Israelites are Jewish people. Now, there are Jews who are the descendants of the Israelites. That is a fact. You can't just say that every Jew is not an Israelite. But you also can't say that every Jew is a direct person of the Israel. But this is something that they claim to be false because they wanted to say blacks were. The other issue was 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. They tried to act as if that didn't happen, because that's a statement that's in that program. I watched the whole thing. Then they try to say it's a falsity. These are falsities. These things that they said were false. All races are equal and brothers. That's a falsity. When that's just a few of them. When I watched that and heard that, it just made me understand we're arguing foolishness. Right? We're arguing foolishness and saying that it's not. And that's a problem. And we need to stop doing that. So I may do a show on it and talk about that. But I have a friend that's doing a book. Pastor Race is doing Biblically Black and Blessed 2 book. And it, in some ways, kind of really talks about where Africans fall in God's plan. It's a great book. It should be coming out. I think people should go get it. And if you haven't read his first book, Biblically Black and Blessed, you should go get that book too. You can get it on Amazon. Go order it. Read it. Get a better understanding about who we are before we start arguing what we could be and what we should be. When a majority of the African Americans in this country have no idea of who they are and where they come from. This is why I'm doing this little series here, talking about the African in history. Because we have to do that. But good question. Good question. I really appreciate that. This has been a really good episode. Ladies and gentlemen, I got some things in the work here, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring them up. We are designing a course. You will see coming up here soon that the Erudition Network is designing a curriculum, an actual course. We will try to pre-launch this course before Black History, at the beginning of this coming year. And I hope to get you all support as we talk about some of the things we talked about here tonight and go more in depth about how we as African Americans, how we have gotten to where we are right now, who we are, right? So it will be an early world history course, and it will not be a long one, and it will not be a hard one to follow. That will be coming online. Okay. The other thing is we have a new program called Erudite Insight. You will see some things drop from me probably by tonight or tomorrow as that new program kicks off. Erudite Insight. You will see it if you go and follow us on Facebook. If you go follow us on YouTube, you will be able to click the button and you'll be able to know when those those episodes drop, so that you can get some insight onto some things that are going on today and how they work historically. New program, something I'm looking very much forward to. We've been trying to get off the ground floor for quite some time. But I've been on a minute longer than I wanted to be, and I want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. Please share. If you felt you got value from this program tonight, share. Come back next week and you all tell me what the Wadi Kubanani is and why it's important. Come back next week and talk to me about several things that we talked about tonight. Go out there and pick up that book, The Cushite. Go out there and go pick up The Negro and Our History. Start your own reading on Black history. But until then, I want to thank all of you all. Lastly, if you want to support the Erudition Network, you will see down here as we are scrolling our scroll, please, 5, 6, 10, whatever you can do to help us to grow this network and these programs, please do. We really do appreciate any help that we can get. I'm not limiting it to 5 and 10. Do whatever you feel led to do, but we will really appreciate your help and your support. All right, I've said enough. You all have a great, blessed weekend, and we will see you again here next week. Until then, God bless you.